Secretary of State to create them. Then you also have a private document, and it's called different, it has a different name for different type of entity. You have a bylaws for corporation, you have the operating agreement for an LLC, and you have a partnership agreement for partnerships. And just, remember that's where you get to lay out the rules and regulations of your entity, and it really can be whatever you want it to be. There's very few cases where state law is going to specifically require something that you can't overrule. So for our testing purposes, just assume that you can overrule really anything. Other than the number of shareholder requirements to be an S corp, and you can't change that. But so that would be an example of something you can't change. But 95% or more of everything else, you can pretty much elect how you want to run your company under those different types of agreements. So a question on capital, stocks and bonds. So be familiar with how those are issued in their general definition, just very high level. We talked about a promoter. Those are individuals who really are the ones trying to get a business venture started. They usually have a great idea that may or may not pay off, and they convince people to invest money. And so just be familiar with characteristics of that individual. Again, another question: make sure you know the difference between debt versus equity. Obviously, equity is a ownership stake in the company, and a debt is where the company is borrowing money, both of which bring in capital, but they exchange something different with the investor/shareholder. Again, another question on partnership agreements, just kind of generally what can go in them. There is one, it's highlighted in red, but I remember there is one characteristic that's cannot change. So this is that 5% that we talked about. So just know what that is, which would work with a partnership agreement.
Charactership.
Remember the definition of a foreign corporation? It's not an international company. It's a company that's been incorporated in another state, as opposed to the one that it's operating in, or there's, if you have an issue in a particular state and they're incorporated in another state, that's going to be referred to as a foreign corporation. Make sure you know what needs to be filed in order for that to be properly instructed in another state. Again, definition of a limited partner. So just know that. I think there's three reasons for three events for the termination of an LLC to dissolve. So make sure you know what that is. Here's what a de facto corporation is. A de facto corporation. Anybody remember that?
The sun.
That's where you've attempted to create a corporation, but you failed, but you still have been operating in good faith. Be sure and know that definition. Another little fact pattern on a company that is rights shareholders have as opposed to directors. We talked about specific things each can do. Make sure you know what those are. In kind of a related question, just asking a different way, what rights does a shareholder have in a corporation? There's a question on capacity to become a partner, so make sure you know who has capacity. It goes back to what we discussed in contracts. And who has legal capacity to enter into contracts. It's pretty much the same, at least the way I'm presenting it to you, of the steps to take to extinguish this question is on a limited partner, but there's 3 steps that's taken to extinguish a business entity that we definitely discussed in class, and it's definitely not I read because I remember it. So just know what those are. So just another question about limited partnerships. We've already know limited liability, so just be familiar with that. Another question about written partnership agreement. I don't want to, for true false questions, I don't want to give it away, but again, just make sure you know what can be in and what can be out of a partnership agreement. We discussed the business judgment rule. This can be used by directors and officers to defend against liability, provided they were acting in good faith, they had the best interest of the company in mind, and they were acting as any prudent person would be acting in that position. So be sure and know that definition. Delectus personam is Latin indicating a type of corporation, so you know what that is.
What was that term again?
Delectus, Delectus. I may be pronouncing it wrong. And then the second word is Personae. If you're a sole proprietor, that's just you acting as an individual in your own capacity. You don't have any documentation around it. You will be doing business in your own name. General partnership is 2 or more people acting that way for profit. You can or you don't have to, but you can have a partnership agreement. But if you're 2 people without a partnership agreement, then you're going to be subject to kind of the laws of the state controlling your relationship. Or you can draft a partnership agreement and, again, make a lot of different elections that you want. But just, again, know the definition of a sole proprietorship and the definition of a general partnership. They're basically the same, except you just have additional people for the general partnership. Again, know the characteristics of common stock. Okay, piercing the corporate veil. This is the concept of, I mean, you can apply to all of the different entities, but it's most commonly discussed in terms of corporations where a shareholder has, or even an officer that may not even be an owner, but they're not adhering to the corporate formalities. They're not treating the corporation as a separate legal entity. So, you know, a lot of times you can pierce the corporate veil because you are, you know, taking personal advantage of business opportunities. You're, in essence, stealing money by using the funds for your personal use. You know, it typically arises when it's close to no company, but it can occur for public companies, usually where you have undercapitalized a subsidiary. That can be one of the areas of liability for a bigger company. But, you know, again, just not recognizing and treating the company as separate legal entity and the formalities that you need to recognize in running the company. When can you not declare a dividend? Yes, sir. Perfect. Give me an extra credit request. Yes, so you cannot declare a dividend when the company's insolvent. There's some tests to look at, so just be familiar with that concept. Another little short fact pattern. You got to decide what's the best legal entity. So just again, know the characteristics that we discussed earlier. Another longer fact pattern. So just know the definition we've already discussed this morning and be able to apply it with that. I'll just say this, if you see an answer that you really don't recognize, I mean, hopefully you're studying enough to be able to recognize all the terms, but if you see something as an answer that's you don't recognize, it's probably not the right answer. Okay, 10 more questions. Again, another question about bonds, what they are. Kind of talked about it, nothing needs to be said more than that. Again, another question about articles of incorporation and Secretary of State. Very high level there. I've already mentioned the definition of a general partnership. So just remember what I've already said a moment ago. You know, I mentioned de facto corporation. Make sure you understand the jure corporation, which is my favorite salad dressing as well. DE space JURE. Jure. Again, another question about shareholders and what they have rights to do and not do. Again, the three answers are very similar, if not identical, to some of the other business entities, so you'll see that thread in your study. That might be something you may want to look at to be familiar with for all the companies. Know the consequences of a defective corporation. Defective corporation, you try to file, and for defective, know the consequences. Cumulative voting. Again, this is one of those strategies to maintain control. Give you more, maybe it's a smaller shareholder. To give you a bigger voice when electing. You know, the normal calculation is one vote for each share that you own. Cumulative voting, you multiply the number of shares times the number of directors, and that will be the number of votes that you have for a particular short fact pattern, discussing quorum. Remember, quorum is the amount needed to take a vote. Usually it's 50% or more, unless there's a supermajority requirement that is generally around 2/3. So just know what the quorum requirements are. And the last question is another quorum question. So they're right in a row, and they're both very similar. So just understand the concept of the quorum. They're both true false, by the way. And that's all the questions. Questions, all the questions. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that one of the strategies was to defend the country to control the company. I didn't get the term for the first one you mentioned.
The what, I'm sorry?
Just now when you were talking about cumulative voting, there was another strategy that you mentioned earlier. I didn't get that one. I forgot what it was.
You forgot what cumulative voting is, or what?
No, there was a. Control the board.
We're going to do preemptive rights.
Preemptive rights. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
For the characteristic that you can't change, I didn't get the first part of what you said. Like one of the characteristics that you can't change. Like was it for general
You mean a partnership agreement?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. 'Cause I didn't get
Did
the
I
first,
say, or?
I said I didn't get the first part of what you said.
Sorry?
I didn't get the first part of what you said. Like one characteristic you can't change.
That's kind of the question though, isn't it?
Like, is it in context of like partnership agreements or like?
I mean, I don't recall. Does anyone know what, I mean, I have to go back and look at each question. All I can say is just, you know, if you go look at the, again, all of these are highlighted in red. So, you know, go back and look at what the requirements are, partnerships agreement, operating agreement, and bylaws. And I wasn't gonna ask anything about bylaws, but with regard to partnership agreements, there's one or two things, at least one thing that's mentioned that can't be included. So just, it's in red, so just find that and go through. Yes, sir?
Are you gonna be looking for like one specific thing with that, or like?
What's that?
Are you looking for that one, are you gonna be looking for like one specific thing
Yes,
for that?
yes. It's highlighted, I remember, I can almost picture it, it's highlighted in red. Anything else? Yes, ma'am. Nope. Pick a number, do you want it 15? Okay, I'll give you a free answer. Oh, this is kind of easy, but want to pick another number? Okay, I'll do this one. This is pretty obvious too, but I'll do it because I think it actually applies to another question. So, extinguishing a limited partnership involves winding up the affairs or liquidation, dissolution, and termination. So the answer is 22D, all of the above. So all three of those, those are your three steps of winding up the affairs of a business entity. It's asking about a limited partnership, but those generally apply to all of them, where you kind of wind up the affairs, you dissolve it, and then I think termination relates to actually filing the termination papers with the Secretary of State. Yes, sir.
What were the three?
Well, this now is all of the above. Oh, you want to know, I'm sorry, you're right, it's a good point. Again, winding up the affairs, you can call that liquidation, dissolving, and termination. Those are, again, listed, I think, in at least two places Anything else? Where's my sign-in sheet? Does anyone need to sign it?